Hallowed Tides of the Drowned God, Chapter 10. An Old World Poem. The darkness in the ventilation shaft was a physical thing. It had weight, pressing down on Jorin's back as he lay prone on the grating. It had a taste, too, the sharp, metallic tang of rust, mingling with the ozone scent of failing electrical conduits somewhere below. Every breath was a shallow, measured intake of cold, recycled air, thick with the smell of mildew and a faint, briny dampness that clung to everything in the sump. He was a ghost in the city's metal veins, a fugitive curled in its corroded arteries. The grating bit into his ribs and cheekbone, the grid pattern a faint, painful reminder of his confinement. Below him, through the rusted mesh, the sickly orange of a sodium vapor work lamp cast long, dancing shadows across a maintenance corridor 3 levels down. Empty. For now. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to find a moment of stillness, the one true luxury in Amphitrite. But there was no silence here. Not anymore. The city itself provided the bass note, a constant, deep-frequency thrum that vibrated through the metal into his bones. It was the song of the geothermal turbines, the city's struggling heart. Layered over it was the percussive drip, drip, drip of condensation pooling and falling somewhere nearby, and the sudden, violent shriek of pressure-stressed metal that made his teeth ache. He flinched with every groan of the hull, his body tensing for a breach that never came. That noise, the city's organic pain, he could handle. He'd lived with it his entire life. It was the other noise that was tearing him apart. "Daddy, it's cold down here." Jorin's breath hitched. Lyra. Her voice, once the anchor of his grief, was now just the vanguard of the coming storm. It was thinner than he remembered, frayed around the edges like a worn recording. He pressed the heels of his palms into his eye sockets, a useless gesture against a sound that bloomed from inside his own skull. Just a memory, he told himself, the thought a desperate scrap of driftwood in a rising tide. She's not real. It's the echo. But the choral echo wasn't just an echo anymore. It was a chorus.
"The pressure lock is failing. See the red light. See the red light. It's going to blow." A woman, her voice tight with professional terror. "Seal the bulkhead, now!" Jorin clamped his hands over his ears, a reflexive, pointless act. The voices weren't coming from outside. They were tenants in his head, screaming over each other in a cacophony of final moments, drowning, crushing, panicked shouts, and 100 weeping goodbyes, all jumbled together. They were the archived dead, the lives the echo had consumed before finding him, and they were all waking up. His own thoughts struggled to form a coherent sentence. Move. Need to move. Get to Eldrick. He'll know what to do. But fear was a cold, heavy anchor in his gut. Every groan of the hull was now a potential footstep. Every flicker of the lights below was the sweep of a compliance officer's torch. They were hunting him. Praxilavar. He'd seen the alerts on the public terminals before he'd scrambled into this warren of pipes. Fugitive biocontaminant. Report sightings immediately. Do not approach. A biocontaminant. That's what he was. Not a man, not a welder who'd saved 100 lives in that pipe rupture. Just a disease to be sterilized. He risked a look down again. The corridor remained empty. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against the metal grating. A faint greenish-gold light pulsed from a patch of bioluminescent fungi clinging to the shaft wall a few feet away. In the shifting glow, the texture of the wall seemed to writhe, the rusted metal forming the outline of a face, mouth open in a silent scream, before dissolving back into decay. He blinked hard, the image searing itself onto the back of his eyelids. He was losing his mind. Maybe the psychosis warnings they posted everywhere were real after all. Maybe this was just what the drownings felt like before the end. "He can hear us." Jorin froze. That voice was new. It wasn't panicked or drowning. It was calm, observant, and it felt like it was right behind him. His own thought, sharp and clear with terror. Who can hear us? He held his breath, straining to listen past the choir of the dead in his head. And then he heard it, a definite sound from the world of the real, a metallic scrape, far down the duct. It wasn't the random groan of the archaeology, it was deliberate, the sound of a boot slipping on a rusty surface, or a service panel being pried open. His paranoia, which had been a simmering heat, flashed into a raging fire. They were in the vents. They'd known. Somehow they'd tracked him here. The voices in his head reacted instantly, a wave of collective terror crashing over him. "Rust rot! They found us!" "Be quiet! Don't breathe! Don't even breathe!" Trapped again. The water, the pressure. "Shut up!" Jorin hissed through gritted teeth, the words a raw, broken sound in the tight space. "All of you, just shut up!" He pushed himself backward, scraping his exosuit's worn fabric against the grime-caked metal. His muscles screamed in protest. He needed to find another junction, another path. But which way? The labyrinth of the whispering gills was a maze he only partially knew. One wrong turn could lead him straight into a compliance patrol, or worse, a sealed-off section with no way out. He squeezed his eyes shut again, trying to focus, trying to dredge up a memory of the ventilation schematics he'd studied years ago. But all he could see were faces. A young woman with wide, terrified eyes, an old man with a neat beard, his mouth full of seawater, and Lyra, his sweet Lyra, her small hand slipping from his grasp in a torrent of black, churning water. His own grief was now just another drop in an ocean of suffering. It was being diluted, erased. The thought terrified him more than any compliance officer. Another scrape, closer this time. He flattened himself against the grating, trying to make himself smaller, trying to merge with the shadows. The low orange light from below glinted off something on his hand. He lifted it slowly. The keloid scars on his knuckles, old burn marks from his years as a welder, were no longer just raised pinkish tissue. They were harder, paler. Under the faint bioluminescence, he could see a fine crystalline structure forming, like a delicate lattice of bone-white coral. It was growing. The echo wasn't just in his head. It was in his skin, in his bones. This realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, stealing what little air was in his lungs. Acute, ice-cold paranoia flooded every synapse. He was a walking plague, a monster, and it was getting closer. Suddenly, the cacophony in his head stopped. A single, unified thought, not his own, settled into the silence with terrifying clarity. It was a whisper that felt like a shout. "They can hear your heart." Jorin's eyes flew wide open in the oppressive dark. He could feel it, thump, 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 a frantic, terrified drumbeat against the metal of the shaft, echoing out into the darkness, a beacon, a dinner bell. He didn't dare breathe. He lay perfectly still, a man of rust and bone and burgeoning coral, listening to the sound of his own betrayal. The Compliance Division Command Center was a vault of weaponized silence. Here, in the sterile heart of the spire, the eternal groan of Amphitrite's hull was an engineered memory, filtered out by acoustic dampeners that cost more in jewel chits than a sump dweller's entire life. All that remained was the whisper-quiet hum of recycled air and the faint electrical tang of ozone from the server banks that lined the obsidian walls. Praxilla Var stood before the room's centerpiece, a three-dimensional cartographic display of the sump. It was a phantom, a ghost of wireframes and cold blue light hanging in the chilled air like a captured nebula of despair. The map depicted the city's lowest levels as a chaotic lattice of repurposed cargo containers, pressure-hold habitats, and a maddening filigree of maintenance ducts and ventilation shafts known as the Whispering Gills. It was a tumor clinging to the clean geometry of the arcology's foundation. Her eyes, the color of frozen sea ice, scanned the display. Dozens of pulsing red icons littered the schematic. Each one represented a failed patrol, a dead end, a squad of her compliance officers returning with nothing but the smell of rust and briny damp on their uniforms. Frustration was a low-frequency vibration inside her, a pressure she refused to let show on her placid features. It was inefficient. It was messy. The search for Patient Zero, the welder, Jorin, was devolving into a game of hide-and-seek in a labyrinth built by rats. "Report," she said, her voice cutting through the sterile hum without raising in volume. She didn't turn. Behind her, Officer Kalin flinched. He was young, spire-born, his uniform immaculate, but his posture was a textbook example of pressure-induced stress. "Chief Officer Var, Squad 7, 9, and 12 have completed their sweep of sublevels Gamma and Delta. No contact." Praxilla made a small, dismissive gesture with her index finger. On the map, 3 of the red icons blinked and vanished. A fruitless effort, erased with a flick of the wrist. "The informant from the Tide Lords proved unreliable. The location was a derelict water reclamation node. The squad was delayed by a localized fungal bloom. No sign of the target." Kalen's voice was tight. He was choosing his words carefully, acutely aware that he was the messenger for a series of escalating failures. "Delayed," Praxilla repeated. The word was flat, devoid of curiosity. She knew what delayed meant in the sump. Faulty equipment, structural hazards, the sheer oppressive decay of the lower levels that seemed to actively resist any imposition of order. She saw it all in the map before her. They were searching for a single drop of poison in an ocean of filth, and the ocean itself was hiding it. Her gaze followed a complex network of pipes, the city's metal veins. "He's a welder, a deep maintenance specialist. He knows the city's guts better than your men know their patrol routes. He doesn't need to run. He just needs to recede, to dissolve into the background noise." Kalen took a half-step forward. "Ma'am, with respect, the sump is vast. The unregistered pathways, the decommissioned zones, it's like it swallowed him whole. We could search for a year and not cover it all." A long silence stretched, thick with the hum of the servers. Praxilla's focus sharpened on the holographic sump. She saw the flow of her patrols, the logic of their search patterns, all rational, all systematic, and all utterly useless. The problem with logic is that it assumes a rational opponent. But this was not about one man's survival. It was a biological imperative, A disease does not think, it spreads, and the tissue around it accommodates it. Not by a person, Priscilla countered, stepping away from the map and circling it like a predator studying its prey from a new angle. By the system, by the collective. Their fear of us is becoming greater than their fear of the contagion. They see our patrols, our checkpoints, and they see an invasion. They see a threat to their squalid autonomy. So they turn a blind eye. They hear a rumor and keep it to themselves. They see a shadow flit down a corridor and they walk the other way. That is a form of shelter, a passive conspiracy of silence. She stopped, her back to him again, her reflection a pale specter in the polished obsidian wall. Her frustration was crystallizing now, hardening from a heated liquid into a sharp, cold solid, a resolve. Her methods were wrong. She was trying to catch a whisper with a net. We have been using our eyes, officer. We have been searching for a man. But we are not hunting a man. We are hunting a frequency, a resonance. Ma'am? She turned back to him, a flicker of something almost like excitement in her eyes. It was the look of a scientist who has just solved an impossible equation. The choral echo. The initial reports from sustenance noted its presence through spectrographic analysis of the water, but the more advanced cases, the first-generation data from the founders, the data they classified as mass deep pressure psychosis, it mentions an auditory component, a bioacoustic signature, a hum, just below the range of normal human hearing, generated by the organism's effect on the host's neural pathways. She gestured to the command center's walls. We monitor this entire city for structural integrity. Microphones embedded in the hull listen for the groans of stressed metal, for the shriek of a coming breach. We listen for the city's pain. We are going to retask the system, she declared. The air in the room seemed to get colder. We are no longer listening for the hull. We are going to listen for the infection within it.
Kalen's professional composure finally cracked. A sliver of horror showed on his face. Chief Officer, to do that, you would need to recalibrate every acoustic sensor in the city. You'd be turning the entire structural monitoring grid into a citywide surveillance network. You would be listening inside residential blocks, inside private habitats. The processing power, the violation of privacy protocols. The hull is the whole, officer, Priscilla said, her voice a silken blade. Privacy is a luxury afforded to healthy cells. A cancer forfeits such rights. We will initiate city-wide acoustic purity screenings. We will filter out the thrum of the turbines, the drip of condensation, the conversations and heartbeats of 10,000 souls. And in that manufactured silence, we will listen for the discordant note. We will listen for the hum of the parasite. She walked back to the holographic map, her stride confident, her purpose renewed. The red icons of failure no longer seemed like a testament to her frustration, but a data set marking where not to look. The leash was about to tighten, not just on Jorin, but on Amphitrite as a whole. Get the engineering division liaison on the comm, she commanded. Her eyes traced a path through the sump, a path not of corridors, but of probabilities. Tell them I am invoking the Hull Integrity Act, Section 4, Subsection Gamma. This is no longer a manhunt. It is a sterilization protocol. And I have found my scalpel. The hunger was a physical thing, a cold, hollow ache that gnawed at his insides, worse than the perpetual damp that clung to his skin. Jorin pressed himself deeper into the recess between two humming fluid conduits, the metal vibrating against his spine in the familiar, unsettling rhythm. Below him lay the sump's market square, a skeletal ruin after shift change. The usual cacophony of bartering and complaint was gone, replaced by the city's own lonely heartbeat, the deep-frequency thrum of the geothermal turbines, the erratic drip of condensation from overhead pipes, and the sharp ozonic tang of an electrical junction fizzling out. Rust rot.
The place was a graveyard of commerce. Stalls made from salvaged pressure hull plating stood empty, their surfaces slick with the same black mold that painted patterns across the bulkheads. A flickering sodium vapor lamp cast a sickly orange glow over everything, making the puddles of recycled water gleam like pools of oil. In the deeper shadows, patches of glimmer moss pulsed with a faint, ghostly green, the only beautiful thing in this whole rusted-out pit. His eyes scanned the detritus, empty nutrient paste tubes, discarded wrappers, a broken data pad with a cracked screen. Nothing. The emptiness in his stomach mirrored the emptiness of the square. It had been 2 cycles since he'd last eaten, and the weakness was becoming a liability. It dulled his senses, slowed his thoughts. A slow death in a city that specialized in fast ones. Then he saw it. Hope, packaged in a small silver-gray rectangle. A ration pack. It lay half-submerged in a scummy puddle next to a closed noodle stall, probably dropped during the hurried exodus at the shift bell. It wasn't much. A block of nutrient paste, maybe a hydro sachet if he was lucky, but it was everything. It was one more day. He waited, listening. The city groaned, a long, mournful shriek of stressed metal from somewhere in the superstructure, a sound so common it was almost soothing. No footsteps, no voices. The compliance patrols were predictable, their routes timed to the minute. He had 3, maybe 4 minutes before the next one swept through. His body screamed for him to stay hidden, to not take the risk, but the hunger was a more immediate tyrant. He pushed off the conduit, his worn boots making almost no sound on the grated floor. He moved low and fast, using the abandoned stalls as cover, a ghost in the orange twilight. The air was thick with the metallic scent of decay, a smell he knew better than his own. Every drip of water sounded like a gunshot. Every hum of a failing capacitor felt like an alarm about to blare. He reached the noodle stall, its neon sign, a simple blue bowl flickering erratically, casting twitching shadows. The ration pack was right there, 10 feet away. He crouched behind a stack of empty protein crates, his heart hammering against his ribs. The silver gray of the pack was a beacon. He could almost taste the bland, chalky paste. He could feel the blessed, simple relief of a full stomach. He took a deep breath, the ozonic air searing his lungs, and darted out from behind the crates. His fingers stretched, trembling slightly, reaching for the prize. The cold, grimy water of the puddle lapped at his knuckles. He was almost there. His fingertips brushed the foil wrapping. And the world broke. It wasn't a sound. It was a shattering of reality. The orange sodium light, the dripping pipes, the metal under his feet, all of it vanished. He was no longer in the sump. He was in cold, crushing blackness. Water. Dark, silent, and absolute. Panic, not his own, seized him. It was a woman's panic, sharp and shrill in his mind. Her terror was his. Her lungs were his. He wasn't reaching for a ration pack. His hands were clawing at a smooth, unyielding surface. A viewport. Outside, not the familiar abyss he knew from his welding dives, but a chaotic swirl of debris and escaping air. A hull breach. Her breath hitched, a desperate, ragged sound that echoed in his own throat. She thrashed, legs kicking against something that wasn't there. The water was a physical weight, pressing in, stealing warmth, stealing air. No, please, no. The thought wasn't his, but it filled his entire being. He saw through her eyes, the frantic, useless struggle, the dark hair floating around her face like a shroud, the wide, terrified eyes of a man, her husband, a crewmate, on the other side of a pressure door that was rapidly sealing shut. His mouth was open in a silent scream. Her own mouth opened, but only a torrent of icy water flooded in, a violation that choked the soul. It tasted of salt and metal and the end of everything. The pressure built behind her eyes. The light from the corridor beyond the closing door was shrinking, a final cruel star winking out of existence. Jorin collapsed. He hit the grated floor of the market with a splash, the impact shocking the memory away. He was back. The orange light, the dripping water, the smell of rust. He was on his hands and knees, choking, gagging, not on seawater, but on air that felt too thin, too empty. His lungs burned. He could still feel the phantom pressure, the icy cold seeping into his bones. His vision swam, the edges blurring into a dark vignette. He blinked, trying to clear his head, trying to separate his reality from the one that had just been forced upon him. The woman's terror still clung to him like a wet film. Her name was... he didn't know. It didn't matter. She was just one of them, one of the echoes. And then he saw the light. A brilliant, sterile white beam sliced through the darkness, sweeping across the far wall of the market square. It moved with cold, mechanical precision, a compliance patrol. They were early, or he was late. The hallucination had stolen his time, left him exposed and vulnerable. His body was frozen. His limbs felt heavy, waterlogged. He tried to scramble back, to pull himself into the shadows of the noodle stall, but his muscles wouldn't obey. The beam crept closer, illuminating a line of black mold, then the rusted leg of an overturned table. It was going to touch him. It was going to find him. His life was measured in the slow, inevitable sweep of that light. At the last possible second, instinct took over, a surge of pure animal fear. He threw himself sideways, a clumsy, desperate roll that sent a spray of filthy water into the air. He landed behind the stall's counter, pressing his body against the cold, damp metal. He held his breath, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The white beam flooded the spot where he had been just a moment before, painting the puddle and the lost ration pack in stark, unforgiving detail. It hovered there for an eternity. He could hear the faint, rhythmic crunch of their boots on the grating. 2 of them. Then, as slowly as it came, the beam moved on. The footsteps receded. Silence, save for the city's endless groaning, reclaimed the square. Jorin let out a breath he didn't realize he was holding, a ragged, shuddering thing. He remained crouched in the dark, trembling. The hunger was still there, a dull throb beneath the adrenaline, but the desperate hope it had inspired was gone. In its place was a new and profound terror. It wasn't the patrols he had to fear most. It wasn't Prexilavar or her brutal lockdown. The true enemy was inside his own skull, wearing the faces of the dead. It would wait until he was at his weakest, at his most desperate, and then it would pull him under.
The phantom taste of salt still coated his tongue, a ghost of the drowning that was not his own. Jorin's back was pressed against the cold, weeping metal of the alley wall, the rough texture of biomineralized rust biting into the thin fabric of his jumpsuit. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to force out the memory of lungs filling with icy black water, the silent scream of a man named what? The name was gone, washed away by the next tide of another's terror. All that remained was the residue of the experience, a slick film of dread over his own consciousness. His breath came in ragged bursts, each exhale a cloud of vapor in the sickly orange glow of a failing sodium lamp overhead. The alley stank. It was the signature perfume of the sump's forgotten corners, the sharp, electric tang of ozone from a sparking conduit, the damp, earthy rot of glimmer moss in the seams of the bulkheads, and the sour odor of refuse from the marketplace, all layered over the eternal briny scent of recycled water. Above it all, the deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite's geothermal heart vibrated through the deck plates, a constant reminder of the crushing weight of the ocean above and the boiling pressure of the planet's core below. It was the city's pulse, a rhythm he used to find comforting. Now it sounded like a death rattle. He had stumbled in here after the pipe had burst, after he'd somehow known exactly where to strike with his cutter to vent the pressure. The cheers of the crowd had sounded like static, their faces a blur. The real event had happened inside his head, a full sensory immersion into a maintenance worker's final moments during a breach a decade ago. He had felt the man's panic, his love for a child with bright red hair, his final, suffocating regret. And when he'd come back to himself, the faces in the crowd had looked at him with awe, but he had only felt like a grave robber, a ghoul who wore other people's deaths like a second skin. He needed to move. Prexilavar would have his name by now, the hero of the sump, the welder with the uncanny instinct. In Amphitrite, being special was just another way of being a target, a deviation from the norm, a threat to the whole. His face would be on every monitor, his name flagged for immediate detention. Compliance would be hunting him. That thought, cold and sharp, was enough to cut through the lingering fog of the echo. He pushed himself off the wall, his muscles screaming in protest. His welder's kit felt heavy on his hip, the familiar weight of his plasma cutter and sonic wrench a hollow comfort. He took a step toward the alley's mouth, where the chaotic sounds of the sump market bled into the relative quiet. The clang of metal on metal, the murmur of 100 haggling voices, the sizzle of protein paste on a vendor's hot plate. Freedom was 20 paces away. And then a shadow detached itself from the deeper darkness at the alley's entrance. It didn't move into the light, it simply consumed it, a block of solid blackness where there was none before. Jorin froze, his heart seizing in his chest. The shape was massive, a silhouette of a man broader and taller than anyone had a right to be in the cramped confines of the sump. The market sound seemed to dim, muffled by a sudden, oppressive silence. Rust-rot. Compliance. He had waited too long. His training, his instinct, screamed at him to run. He glanced back. The alley was a dead end, culminating in a rusted-shut ventilation grate. No escape there. His hand went to the grip of his plasma cutter, his thumb hovering over the ignition.
It was a tool, not a weapon, but against a single officer it might buy him a few seconds. A desperate, stupid thought, but it was the only one he had. As he drew the cutter, a second figure emerged from a recessed doorway to his left he hadn't even noticed. This one was just as large. They moved with a predatory grace that was utterly alien to the stiff, brutish efficiency of compliance enforcers. Their gear wasn't the standard-issue gray and blue. It was a patchwork of scuffed, matte black armor plating, scavenged pressure suit components, and thick, worn leather. They were phantoms born of the sump's own dark corners. Before Jorin could even fully turn, the first man was on him. There was no shouted command, no formal arrest protocol, just a silent, explosive burst of motion. A huge hand, wrapped in a reinforced glove, clamped down on his wrist, not crushing, but absolute. The pressure was immense, the grip unshakable. Jorin felt his fingers go numb, and the heavy plasma cutter clattered uselessly to the grimy floor.
At the same time, the second man pinned his other arm behind his back, his body a wall of muscle that absorbed Jorin's panicked struggle without even shifting. A practiced hand swept down his sides, expertly locating and unhooking his tool belt. The sonic wrenches, the spanners, the diagnostic pad, his life, his trade, were stripped from him in a single fluid motion and tossed into a burlap sack with a dull thud. They disarmed him not like a threat, but like an asset being inventoried. He thrashed once, a spasm of pure animal fear, but it was like pushing against a hydraulic press. He was utterly, completely helpless. And then something inside him broke. The terror didn't vanish, but it was suddenly overshadowed by a profound, soul-deep weariness. He'd been running from the ghost of his daughter, from the echoes of the drowned, from the structural failures of the city, and from the looming threat of Praxilla-Var. He had been fighting on every front, internal and external, for so long, and he was just so tired. The fight drained out of him, leaving an empty, hollowed-out vessel. His muscles went slack. His head drooped. He stared at the deck plates, at the green-gold shimmer of bioluminescent fungi growing in a pool of stagnant water. The manacles they locked onto his wrists were cold and heavy, not the lightweight polymer of compliance restraints. These were raw, unpolished steel. These weren't compliance. The realization settled not with relief, but with a new, colder kind of dread. Compliance was a known quantity. Their brutality had rules, their procedures a grim logic. This was something else. This was the Sump's shadow government, the power that operated in the spaces between the bulkheads, the Tide Lords. He'd been caught, but not by the net he was expecting. He was a piece in a game he didn't even know he was playing. The man in front of him bent down and retrieved the plasma cutter, weighing it in his palm with a thoughtful tilt of his head. His face was hidden in the shadow cast by his own bulk, nothing more than a jawline and a mouth set in a neutral line. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod to his partner.
Jorin felt a hard prod in his back, a silent command to walk. He lifted his head, his gaze sweeping over the two hulking figures. They were ghosts of the deep, enforcers for a black market king who ruled the city's forgotten depths. He had lost his freedom, not to the sterile order of the spire, but to the murky, lawless power of the abyss itself. He didn't resist. He took a step, then another, his boots splashing softly in the filth. They led him away from the market's light, away from the familiar corridors, and into a narrow, unlit service passage he'd never seen before. The darkness swallowed them whole. The only sound was the drip of water,
the hum of the city, and the quiet, weary resignation of Jorin's own breathing. He was no longer a man. He was salvage. A hard shove sent Jorin stumbling over a raised pressure seal and into the room. The heavy hatch slammed shut behind him, the metallic boom echoing, not with the usual wet slap of the sump, but with a solid, insulated thud. The sudden silence that followed was more jarring than any klaxon. It was a dead silence, the kind that cost a fortune in sound-dampening foam and reinforced plating. The constant, citywide groan of Amphitrite was gone, reduced to a barely felt vibration in the soles of his boots. He blinked, his eyes stinging. The light wasn't the sickly orange of sodium vapor lamps or the cold, sterile noon of a failing neon sign. It was warm, golden, and steady, emanating from a cluster of pre-inundation filament bulbs that hummed with a clean, stable energy. They illuminated a space that was an impossibility in the lower levels, a dry space. The air didn't smell of ozone, rust, and recycled water. It smelled of warm electronics, the faint dusty scent of ancient paper, and the sterile tang of a high-powered dehumidifier chugging away in a corner. He was in a warlord's throne room, built from the detritus of a drowned world. Piles of salvaged old-world tech were stacked like offerings around a central, worn armchair. Data drives gleamed in slick black towers. An exosuit limb lay on a workbench, its myomer bundles exposed like flayed muscle. And in the chair, legs crossed casually as if he were in a Spire atrium lounge, sat Grendel Brecker.
He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a gut that spoke of better rations than nutrient paste. A thick, dark beard framed a mouth that was currently pulled into an amused smile. He held a small, multifaceted object in his thick fingers, turning it over and over in the warm light. A crystal paperweight from a dead executive's desk, maybe. Grendel's eyes, dark and intelligent, flickered from the crystal to Jorin. He didn't seem to register the two hulking title lords who had brought Jorin here, standing like statues by the door. "Leave us," Grendel said, his voice a low baritone that carried easily in the quiet room. The two men gave Jorin a final dismissive look and exited through a side panel Jorin hadn't even noticed, their footsteps silent on the grated floor. The king was alone with his prize. "Deep and safe, Jorin." Grendel's smile widened. He gestured with the crystal to a metal stool opposite his chair. "Have a seat. You look like you had a rough shift." Jorin remained standing. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs, a counterpoint to the maddening chorus of whispers that swirled at the edges of his hearing. The echo. It was agitated, a stirred-up hive of ghosts reacting to the change in pressure, the strange quiet, the new predator in the room. He felt a phantom memory surface, not his own, of a man named Kinji, a gambler, cornered in a similar room 2 generations ago, owing a debt he couldn't pay. "He knows," a voice whispered. "He knows what we are." "I'm fine," Jorin said, his own voice sounding rough and alien in the pristine quiet. "No, you're not." Grendel set the crystal down on a stack of data drives with a soft click. "You're the most wanted man in the sump right now. Praxillavar's compliance teams are sweeping this whole sector. They're running bioscans at every checkpoint, pulling hull clingers in the quarantine tents for the slightest cough. They're looking for a welder, the one who was at section GAMMA 7 pipe junction just before it blew." He leaned forward, his forearms resting on his knees. The hero who somehow knew exactly which valve to turn to stop a cascade failure. Funny that. Almost intuitive. Jorin's blood ran cold. He said nothing. His gaze darted to the main hatch. It was 3 meters away. Too far. Grendel saw the flicker of his eyes and let out a soft, rumbling laugh.
Don't even think about it. That door won't open without my chit. You're my guest. He reached down beside his chair and produced a glass and a small unlabeled bottle filled with a clear liquid. He poured a finger's worth into the glass. Drink, unfiltered, real minerals, a taste of the old world, or as close as we get down here. To be offered water, real water, as a casual refreshment was the ultimate display of power in Amphitrite. It was worth more than a month's worth of jewel chits on the black market. Jorin stared at the glass, at the tiny beads of condensation forming on its side in the dry air. He could almost taste the phantom minerals, a ghost on his tongue from a life that wasn't his. "What do you want?" Jorin asked, forcing the words past a dry throat. "A partnership," Grendel said simply, taking a small sip from the glass himself. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. I provide you with a sanctuary, a place where Praxilla's hounds can't sniff you out, food, water, a place to rest your head where the only thing that drips is a dehumidifier. I can make you a ghost, invisible." Jorin's jaw tightened. Resignation was hardening into a cold, brittle suspicion. "In exchange for what?" "For that knack you have." Grendel leaned forward again, his voice dropping. "I know what you are, Jorin, what you're becoming. The echo-touched. I've seen it before in the sump rats, but they're all half mad with it, feral. You're different. You're still cogent, still you, mostly." He tapped the side of his own head. "You hear them, don't you? The drowned. And they tell you things. They tell you where the rust is deepest, where the metal is tired, where the pressure is about to win." Every word was a perfectly aimed rivet, pinning Jorin in place. The whispers in his head crescendoed, a frantic sea of voices confirming the truth. He felt a sudden, sharp memory of a woman named Elara gasping for air, her lungs filling with icy brine, her last thought a desperate prayer for her son. Jorin flinched, the sensory flash so vivid he could almost taste the phantom minerals, a ghost on his tongue from a life that wasn't his. "What do you want?" Jorin asked, forcing the words past a dry throat. "A partnership," Grendel said simply, taking a small sip from the glass himself. "A mutually beneficial arrangement. I provide you with a sanctuary, a place where Praxilla's hounds can't sniff you out, food, water, a place to rest your head where the only thing that drips is a dehumidifier. I can make you a ghost, invisible." Grendel's eyes gleamed with triumph. He'd seen it. "The city is dying," the Tide Lord continued, his tone conversational again. "These tremor tides are shaking her to pieces. The Council thinks it's a technical problem. Praxilla thinks it's a disease to be purged. They're fools. It's an opportunity. For a man who knows exactly which salvaged components will fail next, which pressure conduits are about to fetch the highest price, well, that man could secure a very comfortable future for himself and for his friends." There it was, the choice that was no choice at all, a gilded cage offered by a smiling monster. He could be Grendel's divining rod, a tool to profit from the city's slow-motion collapse. Or he could take his chances with the zealot who wanted to put him under a microscope and cut the disease out. "And if I say no?" Jorin's voice was barely a whisper. Grendel finished his drink, setting the glass down with finality. The smile never left his face, but it lost all its warmth. It was the smile of a barracuda. "If you say no," he said, his voice flat and cold, "then I thank you for your time. The side panel will open. My men will even wish you deep and safe as you leave. But the main hatch to this sector is 2 levels up. Praxilla's patrol is already there. They won't ask you for a drink before they put you in chains." Jorin looked at the impossible horde of salvaged light and dry air. He looked at the impassive face of the man who ruled this small pocket of stability. He felt the phantom chill of the abyss, the press of 1,000 drowning souls against the inside of his own skull. He had traded the ghost of his daughter for a legion of the dead. He had traded his life as a welder for the life of a hunted animal. Now he was being asked to trade his soul for a cage. But the alternative was vivisection, annihilation. He thought of Eldrick. He had to get to Eldrick. To do that, he had to disappear first. He finally met Grendel's gaze, the resignation in his gut solidifying into a cold, hard knot of suspicion. This wasn't a sanctuary. It was just a different kind of deep, with a different kind of pressure. "All right," Jorin said, the single word feeling like a betrayal of everything he used to be. "I'm in."
Grendel Brecker's smile became genuine. It was a terrifying sight. "Excellent," he boomed, standing up and clapping his hands together. "First things first, let's get you something to eat. You look like you're about to rust through." The room was a void of polished obsidian and brushed steel, a sterile sanctuary high in the spire atrium where even the ever-present groan of Amphitrite's hole was engineered into silence. Here the air didn't smell of ozone and rust, but of faintly ionized purity, scrubbed clean of the sump's damp decay. It was a silence Chief Compliance Officer Praxilla Var found more unnerving than any shriek of stressed metal. It was the silence of ignorance. At the center of the room, a holographic display cast a cold blue light onto the faces of the Triarch Subcommittee. Counselor Kalin of Engineering, a man whose face seemed permanently etched with the strain of calculating load-bearing tolerances, frowned at the projection. Counselor Orin of Sustenance, softer and paler, nervously wiped a bead of condensation from the glass of water before him. The water in his glass, Praxilla knew, was purer than anything a sump dweller would taste in their lifetime. A 3-dimensional model of the arcology rotated slowly in the blue light. It was a perfect, idealized schematic. Praxilla's data, however, was painting it with cancer. "The vector projections are unequivocal," Praxilla said, her voice a calm, level instrument in the quiet room. She used a datapad to highlight a creeping, sickly green bloom that originated at the taps and was now spiderwebbing through the water reclamation pipes of the lower levels. Sustenance Division's initial report was conservative. The coral echo contamination is not merely present in the system. It is accelerating. Kalin leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Accelerating? Based on what new data, Chief Officer? Your report cites bioacoustic readings, but the source is classified." Praxilla met his gaze without blinking. The data was a lie, but it was a lie that served the truth. The numbers were inflated, the infection rate extrapolated from a single chaotic event in the sump into a citywide pandemic curve. A necessary fiction to move men like Kalin, who couldn't see the fire for the smoke. "My source is a proprietary compliance asset monitoring deep-level comms chatter, Counselor. The phenomenon known colloquially as the whispering gills is not folklore. It is a measurable symptom of early-stage neural colonization. We are seeing a 40% increase in anecdotal reports of auditory hallucinations in the sump in the last cycle alone. Anecdotal reports, Kalen scoffed, waving a dismissive hand. Rust-rot, Prexilla. We're an engineering division, not a psychiatric one. You're asking for authorization to deploy a city-wide acoustic surveillance network. The energy draw alone is substantial, not to mention the procedural overreach. The drownings are also up, Praxilla countered, her tone hardening just enough to cut. 15 confirmed cases of acute violent psychosis in the lower mid-levels. All of them worked near primary water conduits. Is that anecdotal enough for you? Orin flinched, his knuckles white around his glass. His division was responsible for the water. His name was on the line. Praxilla saw her opening. She turned from Kalen to face him. Counselor Orin, your team was the first to detect the organism. You understand its nature. It doesn't just poison the body, it rewrites the mind. It spreads through water, but its true medium is memory. It is a mimetic plague, and we are fighting it with pressure gauges and filtration metrics. We are failing. She let the words hang in the air. The only sound was the faint hum of the holographic projector. What you're proposing, Orin began, his voice thin, it's unprecedented. Listening to every pipe, every vent, it's tantamount to placing the entire population under surveillance. The hull is the whole, Praxilla stated, invoking the city's foundational catechism. Her voice dropped, becoming intimate, conspiratorial, almost a whisper. The individual is a luxury we can no longer afford, not when the individual mind is the very beachhead for this invasion.
She swiped her datapad again. The schematic of the city dissolved, replaced by a simulation. It was a projection, but it felt sickeningly real. The green bloom of the echo pulsed, spreading upwards with terrifying speed. Red alerts flashed across the sump, then the mid-levels. The spire itself flickered, then went dark as the simulation's power grid failed. The model of Amphitrite collapsed in on itself in a silent digital implosion. Orin made a small, choked sound. This is the projected outcome if the current infection rate remains unchecked, Praxilla said, her voice returning to its official impassive cadence. The lie was now a prophecy. Total system failure in 3 cycles. Not a hull breach from external pressure, but a collapse from within. A city that has gone insane. Kalen stood up, his chair scraping against the polished floor. This is fear-mongering, Praxilla. You have no concrete proof for this model. You're using a contamination scare to seize powers the Compliance Division has wanted for a decade. The Acoustic Resonance Protocol is a blank check for total information control. Praxilla did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. She held Kalen's furious gaze and spoke with the chilling certainty of a surgeon explaining a necessary amputation. Counselor, when a limb is infected, you have 2 choices. You can study the bacteria, debate its origins, and mourn the dying flesh. Or you can cut it off to save the body. Your hesitation, your procedural worship, is a death sentence. The hull is the whole. Do you believe that? Or is it just a slogan you recite before dinner? She let her eyes drift back to Orin. He was trembling now, his gaze fixed on the ghost of the imploded city on the display. I need to know where the whispers are coming from, Counselor. I need to be able to hear the infection before it takes root. I need to identify the carriers, the patient zeros, and excise them, for the good of the whole. The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the abyssal water pressing down on the city.
Kalen looked from Praxilla to Orin, his face a mask of disbelief as he saw the decision solidifying in his colleague's terrified eyes. "Orin, don't," Kalen pleaded, his voice losing its sharp edge, replaced by a weary resignation.
Orin wouldn't look at him. He looked at Praxilla. "Article 7 of the Hall Integrity Act," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "In the event of a Grade 4 biocontaminant threat with potential for mass psychogenic effect, a compliance chief officer may be granted temporary oversight of cross-divisional monitoring systems." Praxilla's expression remained unchanged, a perfect mask of solemn duty. Inside, a cold fire of triumph ignited. He had not only agreed, he had given her the legal framework himself. "Thank you, Counselor. The authorization codes will be needed immediately." Kalen slumped back into his chair, defeated. He stared at the empty space where the hologram had been, as if he could still see the city falling. Praxilla gave a curt, formal nod. She turned and walked towards the door, her boots making no sound on the obsidian floor. She had the key, not just to the city's surveillance systems, but to its throat. Now she could finally begin to choke the disease. As the door hissed shut behind her, sealing her in the silent corridor, her lips pulled into the thinnest, most imperceptible of smiles. She had her blank check. The air in the decommissioned conduit was thick enough to drink, heavy with the sharp tang of ozone and the damp metallic scent of a structure losing its long war with the water. Jorin's every breath felt like a trespass. Ghostly green-gold fungi traced patterns of decay across the weeping bulkheads, their faint light doing little to push back the abyssal dark. Water dripped in a maddening, irregular rhythm, each drop a tiny hammer against the silence they were trying to peep. Above it all, the constant deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite resonated through the floor plates, the city's groaning, tired heartbeat. Grendel Brecker moved through the gloom with the practiced ease of a predator. His two crew members, hulking shapes named Koss and Fail, flanked them, their mag boots clanking heavily on the grated walkway. They stopped before it, the conduit. It was a colossal artery of plasteel and ceramic composites, wider than 3 men lying end to end, vanishing into the oppressive blackness in both directions. It was a relic, a piece of the city's original circulatory system, long since bypassed and forgotten. A low, resonant moan emanated from it, a sound of immense contained strain. "Beautiful, isn't she?" Grendel's voice was a low rasp cutting through the damp air. He ran a gloved hand along a support strut, dislodging a cascade of rust flakes. "Pressure exchange main 7. Been sealed for 50 years. The pressure differential between inside and out. Well, let's just say it's spicy." Jorin said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the conduit's immense curved surface. Even from 10 paces away he could feel it, a vibration that wasn't just in the floor, but in the marrow of his bones. In his head, the whispers were a faint static, the ghost of his daughter's voice, a fragile thread in a growing tapestry of noise. "Don't, Daddy. It's heavy."
The old schematics say the founding engineers lined these main arteries with rare earth transducer plates. Osmium, ruthenium, stuff you can't synthesize. Stuff the Spireborn will trade their real sun rations for. Priceless. He turned his head, his eyes accustomed to the low light, finding Jorin's. Problem is, she's under tension. Caught in the wrong place, and she'll implode some fast. We'll be a red stain on the opposite wall before our nerves register the surprise. A very permanent kind of retirement. Koss let out a low chuckle, a sound like gravel turning in a cement mixer. Fail just watched Jorin, his hand resting on the grip of a plasma cutter holstered at his hip. The dread in Jorin's gut coiled tighter. This wasn't a request for help. It was a demonstration. He was the main event. "I'm a welder, Grendel, not a demolitions expert." His own voice sounded hollow, thin. "Ah, but you're more than that now, aren't you, Jorin? You're attuned. You hear things, the music of the deep." He gestured to the groaning conduit with a theatrical sweep of his arm. "So, go on. Listen to her song. Find me the quiet spot, the place where she wants to be opened." Jorin's hands clenched into fists. He was a specimen, a tool, a divining rod for a Tide Lord's greed. The part of him that was still just Jorin, the grieving father, the tired welder, wanted to refuse, to spit in Grendel's face. But he saw the dead-eyed pragmatism in the man's stare, the casual readiness of his crew. Refusal wasn't an option on the table.
Slowly, his mag boots anchoring him to the walkway, he approached the colossal pipe. The thrumming intensified, the low moan becoming a chorus of stresses and strains. The air grew colder. He could feel the unimaginable weight of the ocean on the other side of that wall, a silent, crushing god. He lifted a trembling hand, the keloid scars on his neck and arm pulsing with a faint internal light, their coral-like texture rough against his jumpsuit. He pressed his palm flat against the cold, weeping steel, and the world dissolved. The static in his head exploded into a symphony of torment. It wasn't just his daughter's voice anymore. It was 1,000 voices, 1,000,000, drowning sailors from the old world, their lungs filling with salt. Maintenance workers caught in hull breaches, their last thoughts a shriek of compressed air. He felt the molecular stress of the plasteel as if it were his own skeleton. The groans of the conduit were screams in his mind, the agony of metal atoms being pulled apart by 500 atmospheres of pressure. He felt the cold not on his skin, but in his soul, the absolute zero of the abyss. Memories that weren't his flooded him, the taste of synth protein on a dead man's tongue, the image of a child's toy floating in a flooding cabin, the overwhelming terror of watching a depth gauge spin past its limits. "It hurts, so heavy, can't breathe, the crush, the cold, it hurts." His knees buckled, a gasp tore from his lungs, but it was swallowed by the psychic noise. He was the conduit. He was the pressure. He was the city, groaning under the weight of the sea. His identity was fraying, a single thread snapping in a vast, screaming web. This was what the choral echo was, not an archive, a sensory tomb. "He's doing it." Grendel's voice was a distant disturbance. "Look at his skin." Jorin's own eyes were screwed shut, but he could see it. A point of perfect blackness in the roaring, chaotic storm of sensation. A point of balance. An acoustic null. It wasn't a place of safety, but a point of such perfectly opposed forces that it achieved a state of utter, terrifying stillness. A node in the web where the vibrations canceled each other out. It was a single cold spot on the vast, screaming surface. He pulled his hand back as if burned, stumbling away from the conduit and collapsing against a railing. He was panting, cold sweat plastering his hair to his forehead. The roaring in his head subsided, returning to the familiar, almost comforting static, leaving only the echo of a million deaths. "Well?" Grendel's voice was sharp, impatient. Jorin couldn't speak. He could only lift the shaking finger and point. He pointed to a spot low on the conduit's curve, about 2 meters to the left of a rusted, weeping joint, a place that looked no different from any other. "There," he choked out, the word tasting like rust. "It's quiet there." Grendel stared at the spot, then back at Jorin, a slow, wolfish grin spreading across his face. He nodded to Fail. "Mark it." Fail unholstered a small canister and sprayed a circle of bright orange paint onto the spot Jorin had indicated. The color was a violent intrusion in the gloom. "You see?" Grendel strode over and clapped a heavy hand on Jorin's shoulder. The gesture was meant to be congratulatory, but it felt like a shackle locking into place. "I told you, you're not broken, Jorin. You're valuable." Jorin looked from Grendel's triumphant face to the orange circle on the groaning metal. He had done it. He had used his curse on command. He had turned his private hell, the memory of his daughter, the ghosts of the drowned, into a tool for profit. The overwhelming pressure he'd felt from the conduit was gone, but a new, colder weight settled in its place. It was the weight of what he had become, and the chilling certainty that this was only the beginning. The pressure exchange conduit was a throat, and Jorin was something caught inside it. The air was thick enough to chew, heavy with the sharp reek of ozone and the damp, metallic tang of weeping rust. Every few seconds, a fat drop of condensation would fall from a bundle of cabled viscera overhead, hitting his shoulder with a cold splash that felt unnervingly like a tap from an unseen hand. The only light came from a single, sickly orange sodium lamp 50 meters down the tube, casting his shadow long and warped behind him, a distorted parody of a man. He was trapped. Grendel's pathetic rebellion had shattered against compliance armor, and the sump was a cage of shrieking alarms and slamming bulkheads. This conduit was his only way forward, a path through the city's mechanical guts, but it was a maze. One wrong turn and he'd end up in a filtration grinder or a depressurizing chamber. He needed a map, and the only map was written in the bones of this place. His own mind was a storm of static. The whispers had become a constant low hum beneath the thrumming of the city. Ilara's voice, once a sharp, clear shard of grief, was now just one note in a dissonant choir. He needed to focus, to find the weak point Grendel had babbled about, a structural flaw, an old service junction. He needed to ask the walls for their secrets. And he knew how. His hand trembled as he lifted it toward the curved metal wall. The steel was cold, beaded with moisture that shimmered in the dim light like a skin of liquid diamonds. Ghostly green-gold fungi pulsed faintly in the seams, a bioluminescent infection that mirrored his own. Doing this, he knew, was like pouring a cup of seawater into a glass that was already full. Something had to spill over, Something had to be lost. The distant shriek of stressed metal echoed down the conduit, a reminder of the forces trying to crush Amphitrite, to crush him. He had no choice. He pressed his palm flat against the cold, wet steel. For a moment, nothing. Only the cold, the damp, and the thrumming of his own blood in his ears. Then a spark, not of electricity, but of memory. It surged from the metal into his flesh, a jolt of ice that shot up his arm and bloomed in the base of his skull. The orange light of the conduit dissolved. The sound of dripping water faded. The world rebuilt itself. His hand was no longer his own. It was broader, the knuckles scarred from labor, not from a suit breach. It held not a plasma cutter, but a heavy, archaic rivet gun. The air smelled not of ozone and decay, but of hot metal and fresh sealant, a clean, industrious smell. He stood in the same conduit, but it was new. Gleaming canals of durasteel reflected a brilliant, clean white light. There was no rust, no fungus, no groaning. Only the satisfying, solid hum of a perfectly functioning system. He wasn't Jorin. He was Kalen, a senior structural engineer, first generation.
The feeling that flooded him was alien, pride, a deep, swelling satisfaction that vibrated in his chest. I built this, the thought came, not in his own mental voice, but in a deeper, calmer baritone. This seam, this weld, it will hold for 100 years. For my daughter, to keep her safe. The name echoed in the borrowed mind. Ceres. A tremor shook the conduit, a violent, sickening lurch. Kalen Jorin stumbled, catching himself against the pristine wall. A klaxon blared, sharp and piercing. A voice, tinny over a nearby comm panel, shouted about pressure fluctuations near the primary intake. Panic, cold and sharp, cut through the pride. Kalen's panic. The fear that his perfect creation, his shield against the abyss, was flawed. He remembered running, dropping the rivet gun with a clang that echoed in Jorin's skull, scrambling through the bright, sterile corridors of an Amphitrite that no longer existed. Then the memory shifted, jumping forward. He was in a HAB unit in the sump, but it was clean, the air dry. A little girl with fiery red hair, tied back with twin ribbons of the same color, ran into his arms. Ceres. He could feel Kalen's immense, overwhelming relief, the fear dissolving into pure love. The tremor had been contained, the city held. His daughter was safe. Kalen hugged her tight, burying his face in her hair, smelling the faint, sweet scent of recycled soap. And then the crack appeared. Jorin's mind, his own consciousness, fought back against the intrusion. The image of Ceres began to flicker, like a faulty projector. The red ribbons, no, they were blue. A small synth plastic clip, shaped like a starfish. The one Elara always wore. No, Jorin's mind screamed. The girl's face swam. For a terrifying, eternal second, it was Ceres, then Elara, then a horrifying composite of the two. Ceres's green eyes, Elara's small chin, the red ribbons and the blue clip flickering in and out of existence. He felt Kalen's immense relief at finding his daughter alive, and at the exact same moment, he felt his own soul-crushing agony of finding his daughter gone. The two contradictory emotions tore through him, a paradox that his psyche could not resolve. Who is she? The voices of the echo hissed in the space between heartbeats. Elara, he tried to answer, but the name felt foreign on his mental tongue.
He saw the water. The memory of the hull breach, his own core trauma, bled into Kalen's memory of relief. The clean hab unit was suddenly dark, filled with swirling debris and the icy rush of the abyss. The little girl in his arms was no longer warm and safe, but cold, her hair fanning out in the dark water. The red ribbons unwound, dancing like blood in the gloom. Or was it the blue clip, sinking slowly into the crushing black? He couldn't tell. He couldn't remember. He was reaching for her, but he was also holding her. He was the father who had failed and the father who had succeeded, all at once. "Get out!" he roared, not with his mouth, but with every fiber of his being. He ripped his hand from the wall. The sensation was violent, like tearing his own skin. The world of Kalen shattered, and the conduit rushed back in. The sickly orange light, the drip of water, the low, groaning thrum of the dying city. He fell to his knees on the grating, gasping, the reek of ozone filling his lungs. His hand was raw, red, the imprint of his palm seared onto the metal in a ghostly patch of warmth. He had the information. He knew the weak point. In the chaos of the tremor, Kalen, his crew, had rushed the support strut near Junction 9 Gamma. He could feel the flaw in his bones, a hairline fracture waiting to be exploited. But the cost. He squeezed his eyes shut, trying to summon the one memory that had defined his existence, the anchor of his grief. Ilara. He tried to picture her face. He saw her smile, but her eyes were green. He saw her running toward him on the promenade, but her hair was a brilliant, impossible red. The blue clip was there, but so were the ribbons, tangled together in a knot of corrupted data. The pure, agonizing clarity of his loss was gone. It had been overwritten, blended, polluted. The echo hadn't just shown him someone else's life. It had used his own soul as a template, writing over the parts it found useful. A single glowing tear, faintly bioluminescent, traced a path down his cheek. He was no longer just a father grieving his daughter. He was a library of loss, an archive of stranger sorrows, and his own story was just becoming another dusty, forgotten volume on the shelf. The pressure exchange conduit was a cathedral built to honor the god of crushing weight. Vast, cylindrical, and ribbed with colossal support beams, its curved walls disappeared into a gloom that the handful of sickly orange work lamps couldn't hope to penetrate. The air tasted of ozone and damp, rusted metal, a sharp cocktail that scoured the back of Jorin's throat. Beneath it all, the deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite's heart pulsed through the grated floor, a constant gut-deep reminder of the 7 vertical kilometers of water pressing down from above. "Here," Jorin said, his voice a dry rasp. He lifted a trembling hand, the skin stretched taut over his knuckles, looking almost translucent under the harsh light. The keloid scars on his neck, once smooth and raised from an old suit seal failure, were now puckered and hard, their texture disturbingly like the ridges of infant coral. They itched with a life that wasn't his own. He pointed to a spot on the conduit's main pressure plate, a slab of ceramo steel alloy as thick as his chest. To the naked eye, it was indistinguishable from the 50 meters of plating that curved away on either side, all of it stained with streaks of black mold and weeping perpetual condensation. But Jorin didn't see it, he felt it. The echo in his mind wasn't just voices anymore. It was a physical sensation, a symphony of structural dynamics played out in his own sinews.
He could feel the ghost of 1,000,000 tons of pressure finding a hairline flaw in the alloy, a microscopic lattice imperfection born in a foundry a century ago. It was a knot of tension in his own shoulder, a pulled tendon screaming for release. Across from him, Grendel Brecker stood with his arms crossed, a silhouette of wiry muscle against the distant glow of the sump. His face was a mask of amused skepticism.
The Tide Lord's other man, a silent brute named Voss, simply shifted his weight, his hand resting on a heavy, magnetized wrench at his belt. His gaze flickered between Jorin and Grendel, awaiting a verdict. Grendel didn't look at Riker. His eyes, small and bright like chips of obsidian, remained fixed on Jorin. He was a predator testing the tensile strength of a new trap. "The man's got a point, Jorin. He says we'll be cooked. You say there's a fortune behind that wall. One of you is very, very wrong, and my profit margins don't appreciate being wrong." The chorus in Jorin's head swelled, 100 drowning souls whispering calculations he didn't understand. The death rattles of engineers and welders who had made fatal mistakes near this very spot. They weren't speaking in words, but in pure, intuitive data. The stress is lateral, not perpendicular. A shear line. It will not burst. It will fall. He struggled to translate the overwhelming flood of sensation. "It won't explode," Jorin insisted, his voice shaking but firm. "The flaw, it's a shear plane. The pressure isn't pushing out against it here. It's pulling it down. If you cut along the line, it will cleave. Clean." He could feel the truth of it so profoundly, it was like a memory. He remembered a hull plate giving way on a dive years ago, the explosive decompression that had ripped his daughter from his grasp. This was not that. This was different. This was a release, not a rupture. This was surgery. Riker swallowed hard, the sound loud in the humming quiet. Boss, this is madness. He's hearing things. Everyone knows the echo touched her." "Quiet," Grendel snapped, his voice soft but carrying the sharp edge of a blade. He took a step closer to Jorin, close enough for Jorin to smell the faint, illicit scent of real tobacco on his clothes. "I'm not betting on you, Jorin. I'm betting on the monster in your head. I'm betting all those ghosts you carry know a thing or two about how this city dies." He turned his head slightly towards the welder. "Light it up, Riker." Exactly where he pointed. Riker looked as if he was going to be sick. He sent one last pleading look at Grendel, who just gave a curt, dismissive nod. With a final, resigned breath, Riker lowered his protective visor and raised the plasma cutter. His hands trembled, but he held the nozzle steady, its tip a finger's breadth from the line Jorin had felt in his bones. Jorin's heart hammered against his ribs. The voices in his head went silent, a sudden terrifying hush of anticipation. What if I'm wrong? What if it's just me? Just the grief twisted into something new? Riker pulled the trigger. A violent, electric hiss crackle erupted, and a brilliant, searing needle of white-blue light stabbed into the alloy. The smell of ozone became overpowering. Sparks showered the grated floor, bouncing like incandescent rain before dying. Jorin flinched, but held his ground, his eyes fixed on the point of contact. He could feel the energy of the cut, not just see it. He felt it severing the molecular bonds, tracing the exact line of stress the echo had shown him. It was a feeling of excruciating rightness, like setting a dislocated joint. The cutter moved slowly, leaving a glowing, molten scar across the face of the plate. The only sound was its vicious hiss and the strained breathing of the men. A high-pitched whine began to build, the sound of metal under unimaginable strain. Riker's whole body was tense, ready to drop the torch and run. "Keep going," Grendel commanded, his voice unnervingly calm. The whine sharpened to a piercing shriek. This was the moment of rupture. Jorin braced himself for the roar of superheated steam, for the gut punch of a shock wave, for the memory of drowning to become his reality. Instead, there was a sound like the world's largest bell being struck once, a deep, resonant thrum that vibrated up through the soles of Jorin's boots and into his teeth. It wasn't the sound of an explosion. It was the sound of release. The shrieking stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then, with a groan of shearing metal, a perfect rectangular section of the 2-foot-thick pressure plate fractured along the molten cut line. It hung for a second, then tilted forward and fell with a monumental, deafening clang that echoed down the length of the conduit, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the city.
The air filled with a cloud of steam and vaporized lubricant. Voss and Riker had thrown their arms up to shield their faces. Grendel hadn't moved an inch. As the vapor cleared, Jorin saw it. Where the solid, rusted wall had been, there was now a dark cavity. The fallen plate lay on the floor, its edges cut as cleanly as if by a factory press, and inside the wall, a sight no one had seen since Amphitrite was built. Packed into a structural void, shielded from a century of corrosion, was a dense bundle of pre-inundation wiring, thousands of strands of pure, gleaming copper, thick as a man's arm. They were webbed with crystalline formations of mineral salt, uncontaminated and shimmering with a faint internal luminescence, catching the orange glow of the work lamps. A king's ransom in salvage. Enough refined metal and rare minerals to corner the sump's black market for a year. Riker slowly lowered his plasma cutter, his mouth agape. Voss took a half-step forward, his professional stillness finally broken by disbelief. The echoing clang faded, leaving only the city's thrum and the drip of water. Grendel was perfectly still for a long moment. He looked from the glittering fortune in the wall to Jorin, then back again. Slowly, the skeptical line of his mouth twisted, spreading into a wide, predatory grin. It was not a smile of happiness. It was the grin of a shark that had just discovered its prey could bleed gold. His eyes gleamed with a terrifying, greedy astonishment. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. Jorin felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the abyssal pressure outside. He had proven his ability. He had proven his immense value. And in that moment, seeing the look in Grendel's eyes, Jorin knew he was no longer a man on the run. Praxilla Var stood in darkness, a stark silhouette against the cold blue light of a dozen monitors. Her office, high in the spire, was a sterile pod of brushed steel and obsidian floors, soundproofed against the perpetual groan of Amphitrite. But she could still feel it, a vibration that worked its way up through the city's bones and into her own, a constant reminder of the fragility she was sworn to defend.
On the central display, a dozen feeds showed the atrium transit hub one level below. It was shift change. The simulated daylight bathing the spacious concourse was dimming into a soft, synthetic twilight. Citizens of the spire, administrators and their families, moved with a languid purpose their sump-dwelling counterparts could never afford. Their conversations were a low civilized murmur, their footsteps echoing softly on the polished floors. Normalcy, a fragile, porous illusion she was about to shatter. "Cadet," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet hum of the room's air recyclers. "Status report." A young woman in a crisp gray uniform flinched, her fingers skittering across a side console. "All nodes are green, Chief Officer. The acoustic purity network is ready for system-wide integration. On your command." Praxilla didn't look at her. Her gaze remained fixed on the people on the screen. A child in a bright yellow jacket pointed at the mirrored outer dome, her face a mask of wonder. A couple held hands, their heads close together in shared confidence. Cells in the body of the city, unaware of the sickness festering in the blood. They saw only their own small lives. Praxilla saw the whole. "Initiate the Sonus protocol," she commanded. "Cascade activation, all public sectors, Spire first." "Acknowledged." The cadet's voice was tight. A few keystrokes, a moment of hesitation, and then a final, decisive tap. On the screens, nothing happened for a second, 2. Then a subtle change. The thin decorative archways that punctuated the transit hub, previously inert structures of brushed metal, pulsed with a faint internal orange light. A low-frequency hum, just at the edge of human hearing, bled into the environment. It was nothing like the deep-bellied groan of the hull. This was a clean, electronic thrum. The sound of a machine listening. Praxilla watched the crowd. The change was immediate. The civilized murmur faltered. A man speaking on his wristcom paused, tilting his head. The couple holding hands pulled apart slightly, looking around. The child in the yellow jacket stopped pointing, her expression of wonder souring into confusion. She tugged on her mother's sleeve. The feeling was palpable, even through the glass and circuitry of the monitors. The air itself had become an ear.
"Acoustic resonance is nominal," the cadet reported, her eyes wide. "Biosignature scanners are populating the database now. We are logging every individual in the active zones." Praxilla leaned forward, her fingertips resting on the cool surface of her console. Data streamed in columns beside the video feeds. Heart rates, vocal stress indices, core temperature fluctuations. A city's worth of vital signs, rendered as neat, orderly numbers. It was beautiful. It was control. "This is not tyranny," she told herself. "It is triage." The choral echo was not a mere infection. It was a competing ideology, a disillusion of the self into a chaotic, screaming collective. It was the antithesis of the hall. To fight it, the hall had to become more itself, a single, unified organism with one will. Her will. Chief Officer?" the cadet stammered. "The stress metrics are climbing, across the board. Average heart rate is up 12%. "That is to be expected," Praxilla said calmly. "An immune system response. The body recoils from the needle before the medicine can work. They will adapt." "But the mandate from the council was for targeted screening, not this," the cadet whispered, gesturing vaguely at the screens where the transit hub had grown unnervingly quiet. People were moving quickly now, avoiding eye contact, their shoulders hunched. The open, spacious concourse had suddenly become a place of exposure. "The council is a committee of compromises, cadet," Praxilla said, her voice dropping, each word a chip of ice. "They would debate the proper decibel for a fire alarm while the city burns. They lack the will to make the hard choice. I do not." Suddenly, one of the archways on screen flashed a brighter, more insistent crimson. A box appeared on Praxilla's display, highlighting an elderly man in a worn but clean technician's jumpsuit. He had been shuffling toward the transport tube, coughing quietly into his fist. "Alarm, vocal tremor anomaly, stress index 4.7, bioresonance signature irregular." "We have a flag," the cadet said, her voice sharp with alarm. "Hold," Praxilla commanded.
On the screen, 2 compliance officers, who had been standing impassively near a bulkhead, began to move. They did not run. Their movements were fluid, deliberate, and utterly devoid of panic. The crowd parted before them like water around stones. The old man looked up, his eyes widening in terror as he realized they were walking toward him. He held up his hands, shaking his head. A fit of coughing seized him, a dry, rattling sound that was now amplified over the hub's speakers, isolated by the Sonus system. "He's just an asthmatic from the upper-level reclamation crew," the cadet said, her fingers flying over her console to pull up his file. "His name is Leo Jax, 72 years old, perfect compliance record." "The system flagged a bioresonance anomaly," Praxilla stated, unmoved. "His asthma could be a symptom. The parasite manifests differently. We can't take chances, not anymore." The officers reached the man. One placed a firm hand on his shoulder. The other held up a small handheld scanner. The old man was babbling, protesting his innocence, but his words were lost in the pervasive hum that now seemed to swallow all other sounds. The crowd watched, frozen, a captive audience to this quiet, sterile display of power. Praxilla watched the numbers on her screen. As the officers detained him, a wave of fear rippled through the hub. A new set of data overlays appeared on her main monitor. A schematic of the spire, now dotted with thousands of tiny, color-coded points of light. Green for calm, yellow for unease, red for panic. The transit hub was a festering bloom of yellow and red. It was a map of fear. Her map. Every flicker of anxiety, every whispered doubt, every panicked heartbeat was now a data point she could track and analyze. The infection had spread by hiding in the quiet, unseen spaces. Now there were no more quiet spaces. She had turned the very air into an instrument of compliance. The walls were listening. Her gaze swept across the city-wide display, her eyes searching for the true anomaly. Not this frightened old man. She was hunting for a ghost, a welder from the sump who carried the seed of the city's destruction within him. This network, this web of fear and surveillance, was the net she would use to catch him. "Let them be afraid," Praxilla whispered to the reflection of her own unwavering eyes in the bark screen. "Fear keeps the hull intact." The noise was a physical thing, a blunt instrument hammering against Jorin's skull. Rough laughter, the percussive clank of salvaged containers used as mugs, the distorted whine of some pre-inundation song sputtering from a jury-rigged speaker. It all blended with the ceaseless deep-frequency thrum of Amphitrite itself, a sound he usually found comforting, the city's own groaning heartbeat, but which now felt like the purr of a beast digesting him. He was slumped against a curved, sweating bulkhead in the heart of Grendel's hub. The air, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and the sharp metallic tang of ozone from a nearby power conduit, did little to clear his head. His hands, resting on his knees, wouldn't stop shaking. Not a tremor from cold or fear, but a deeper vibration, an aftershock of the torrent of information he'd channeled. The pipe. He had seen its breaking point not as a welder would, but as the water had, a cold, alien geometry of stress and fatigue. A voice that was not his had whispered the exact pi threshold into his mind. He had saved them, and the act had hollowed him out completely. Now the chorus of the drowned in his head was muted, a sated, murmuring tide. The silence was almost worse.
There he is, the man of the hour, the sump's own rust-rotting oracle. Grendel Brecker's voice sliced through the din. The Tide Lord was a mountain of a man, his bulk parting the celebrating crew like a ship's prow through water. He wore a grin that was all predator, his eyes glittering with avarice in the sickly orange glow of the work lamps. In one massive hand he held a dented metal flask, in the other a protein bar of a grade Jorin hadn't seen outside of Spire-born ration packs. He shoved the bar into Jorin. "Eat, you earned it." Grendel then unscrewed the flask and took a long pull, a stream of the clear, pungent liquid running down his beard. It smelled like fermented glimmer moss and battery acid. He offered the flask to Jorin. Jorin shook his head, his throat too tight to speak. The thought of putting anything inside his body felt like a violation. Grendel laughed boisterously. "Suit yourself. More for us." He turned to his crew, raising the flask. "To Jorin, who felt the tide in his bones and led us to a haul that'll keep us in jewel chits for a cycle."
A ragged cheer erupted. Men and women, their faces smudged with grime and lit with greedy triumph, raised their containers. They were toasting him, toasting the monster in his head. The sight sent a wave of nausea through Jorin's empty stomach. He'd helped them raid a municipal conduit, diverting pressure to a secondary line so they could strip a junction box of its rare earth regulators. It was a crime that would earn a man a lifetime in the reclamation vats. To them, it was just another Tuesday. To him, it was a terrifying new stage of his decay. "See?" Grendel said, turning back and leaning in, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial rumble. The smell of his breath was overpowering. "I told you, you've got a gift, son, a real gift." He clapped a heavy, proprietary hand on Jorin's shoulder. The weight was immense, pinning him to the bulkhead. That stunt with the pipe and the G-sector passage, and now this? That's not luck. That's something else. Jorin flinched at the touch. He could feel the calluses on Grendel's palm, the heat of his skin, and beneath it, something else. A flicker of a memory, not his own. A grimy hand gripping a wrench, knuckles white with strain, the taste of blood and ozone. He blinked, and it was gone. Just Grendel's hand on his shoulder. "I have to go," Jorin managed, his voice a dry rasp. "Eldrick will be worried." Grendel's smile tightened, losing all its manufactured warmth. "Eldrick. Yeah, good man, Eldrick. Salt of the sump. An old-timer, though. A relic. Lives in the past." His grip on Jorin's shoulder became a vice. "The past is a drowned world, Jorin. There's no future in it." "He's my friend," Jorin insisted, trying to shrug off the hand, but it was like moving a piece of the hull. "And he can't protect you," Grendel stated, his voice flat and cold, a stark contrast to his earlier cheer. The party raged on around them, but their small space had become a pocket of absolute chilling gravity. Not from compliance, not from what's coming. Braxillavar has her hounds sniffing every vent in the sump. They know the leak came from down here. They're looking for a scapegoat, a patient zero. He leaned closer still, his lips almost touching Jorin's ear. "They're looking for you." Ice flowed through Jorin's veins. He knew Grendel was right. The heroic act that had brought him to Var's attention had painted a target on his back. "But with me, with us, you're invisible," Grendel continued, his tone shifting again, becoming reasonable, paternal, a wolf explaining the virtues of its den.
You have a permanent place here now, Jorin, in the Tide Lords. Food, a bunk, protection. All you have to do is listen to those whispers in your head and tell me what the city is going to do next. The offer hung in the air, slick and poisonous. It wasn't an offer. It was a statement of fact. The party noise, the shouting and laughter, began to sound distant, filtered through a thick wall of water. All Jorin could hear was the low thrum of the turbines and the blood pounding in his ears. I can't, Jorin whispered, shaking his head. Despair was a cold, heavy thing, sinking through his exhaustion. This isn't me. Grendel finally straightened up, his shadow swallowing Jorin whole. He took another swig from his flask, wiping his mouth on the back of his hand as he surveyed his domain, the salvaged tech, the loyal crew, the stolen goods, and now his newest acquisition. Of course it is, he boomed, the smile back on his face, wider and more terrifying than before. It's the new you. He looked down at Jorin, his eyes devoid of anything but cold, hard calculation. And you have proven yourself far too valuable to ever let go. An asset like you, well, you don't just let an asset walk away. He clapped Jorin's shoulder again, a gesture of finality, a brand. Think of it as permanent employment with benefits. Grendel turned and strode back into the heart of the celebration, his laughter mixing with the others.
The room was a box, a repurposed cargo pod, Grendel had called it, wedged into the sump's unmapped underbelly. The air was thick with the familiar perfume of Amphitrite, the ozone sharpness of failing conduits, the damp, metallic tang of rust, and beneath it all, the ever-present briny hint of recycled water. A single sodium vapor lamp cast a sickly orange glow over the corrugated steel walls, making the shadows writhe like deep-sea fauna. There was no window. There was never a window. Deep and safe, Grendel's parting words. The irony was a physical weight in Jorin's chest. He sat on the edge of a thin cot, the springs groaning in protest. The city thrummed around him, a constant, deep-frequency vibration that was more felt than heard. The ceaseless churn of the geothermal turbines, the heartbeat of Amphitrite. Here, in the quiet of the box, the other sounds became distinct. The rhythmic drip of condensation plopping from a pipe overhead. The distant, high-pitched shriek of pressure-stressed metal, a sound so common that most hall clingers no longer even noticed it. To Jorin, it sounded like a scream. He pushed himself to his feet. His muscles ached with a deep cellular weariness that had nothing to do with labor. It was the ache of being a vessel. The memory of the sump-level pipe bursting was still sharp, not as a panicked event, but as a moment of terrible clarity. He hadn't thought. He hadn't calculated. He had simply known. He had felt the precise point of structural fatigue in his own bones, a phantom pain that guided his hands to the emergency sealant valve moments before the rupture. He had saved them, hundreds of them, and in doing so, he had announced himself to whatever was hunting him, and to himself. The whispers had been a constant companion since his return from the taps, a maddening chorus just at the edge of hearing. But after the pipe, they were louder, bolder. They were no longer just echoes of his Elara, but a cacophony of strangers. The pressure on my chest, so heavy. Metal screamed, and then the water. "Can't find the hatch! Oh God, it's dark! Rust rot!" Jorin pressed the palms of his hands against his temples, the gesture useless. The voices weren't in his ears, they were in the wiring of his mind. He needed to see his face, to ground himself in something real, something his. He stood. One of Grendel's men had bolted a rectangular sheet of polished steel to the wall, a mirror, a luxury down here. He walked towards it, his boots scuffing against the gritty floor. He saw his reflection swim into focus under the jaundiced light. Gaunt, haggard. The deep lines etched around his eyes and mouth seemed more pronounced, canyons of grief and exhaustion. That was him, Jorin, deep-sea welder, father. He leaned closer, his breath fogging the cold surface. He looked into his own eyes, and the stranger looked back. It was a subtle wrongness, a flicker in the depths of his pupils. His eyes were his own, a familiar, tired blue. But the light they held was not. It was a borrowed light, tinged with the ghostly green gold of abyssal bioluminescence. They held the memory of water pressure he had never felt, the terror of alarms he had never heard. They held the last frantic moments of people he had never met. "No," he breathed, the word a small desperate cloud in the air. He needed to find an anchor, the one pure, untainted piece of him that the choral echo couldn't touch. Elara. He closed his eyes, shutting out the alien reflection. He tried to build her in his mind, his one act of faithful reconstruction. Her unruly dark hair, always escaping its clasp. The gap between her two front teeth when she smiled. The way she used to trace the keloid scars on his neck with her small finger, calling them his sea maps. He held on to the fragments, trying to stitch them into a whole. He tried to summon the memory that haunted him most, the one he had replayed 1,000,000 times, the memory of her in the flooding observation deck. The water, the swirling chaos, her face framed by floating hair. Her hair, it wasn't dark. It was blonde, a pale cloud in the murky water. His eyes snapped open, the image shattered, but the echo of it remained, burned onto his retinas. That wasn't Elara. The face he had just seen for a sickening, heart-stopping second was not his daughter's. The eyes were a different shape, a different shade of terror. The uniform she wore was not from the creche in Amphitrite Sump, but an older design, a pre-inundation salvage crew patch on the shoulder. "Daddy, the window, it's cracking!" The voice was a girl's, but it wasn't Elara. It was someone else's child, someone else's final memory. A memory he now possessed with the same visceral, soul-crushing clarity as his own. The choral echo hadn't just added a voice to the chorus. It had taken his most sacred memory and blended it with another's. It was overwriting his grief. He stumbled back from the polished metal, a wave of vertigo and nausea washing over him. A choked gasp escaped his lips. He looked down at his hands, turning them over and over. The calluses were his. The grease under his fingernails was his. But the faint, almost imperceptible web-like pattern on the skin between his fingers. That was new. That was the echo. He traced the C-map scar on his jaw. He remembered the jolt of the faulty welding torch, the searing pain, the medic shouting. It was his memory, wasn't it? For the first time, a sliver of doubt, cold and sharp as obsidian, slid into his mind. How many of his memories were truly his anymore? Was the ache in his back from his last dive, or from a man named Silas, whose spine snapped in a hull collapse 70 years ago? The crushing despair he had felt for years began to recede, replaced by something far colder, far more terrifying, a profound and total alienation from the man in the reflection. He wasn't a man haunted by a ghost. He was becoming a ghost himself, a collage of drowned souls stitched together in a failing vessel of flesh and bone. He met the stranger's eyes in the metal sheet one last time. The pain was gone. The raw personal agony of his loss was fading, diluted in an ocean of others' sorrow. What remained was a vast, hollow emptiness. He felt the weight of 100 drownings, the collective pressure of the abyss now residing inside him. He was no longer Jorin, father of Alara. He was an archive, and the library was still growing. The Compliance Division Command Center did not groan. It did not drip. It did not smell of rust and brine. Here in the sterile heart of the spire, the city's endemic decay was an abstract concept, a stream of data on a wall of obsidian glass. The air, chilled and filtered to an almost painful purity, tasted of nothing but the faint sharp tang of ozone from the server banks that lined the chamber like silent black monoliths. This was Praxilavar's cathedral, and the litany was data. She stood before the central hololith, a pillar of shimmering blue light that projected a three-dimensional skeletal schematic of Amphitrite. The city rotated slowly, a ghost of girders and conduits hanging in the air. Thousands of tiny pulsing glyphs, her new sensors, flowed through its arteries, a network of nerves she had personally implanted into the city's flesh. They reported pressure, temperature, acoustic resonance, biological particulates. They reported the truth. For 72 hours she had watched. She slept in 4-hour increments on a cot in her adjoining office, subsisting on nutrient paste and bitter black synth coffee. She was hunting for a pattern, a shadow in the machine. The choral echo was a biological entity, but its spread would follow the logic of the city's systems: water reclamation, ventilation, structural weaknesses. It was a disease, and she was the physician viewing the diagnostic scan, searching for the first sign of the tumor. Her face, reflected in the dark glass beyond the hololith, was a mask of severe focus. The whole was the whole. The ideology was not a platitude, it was a physical law. An infection that threatened the parts threatened the entirety. Sentiment was a variable that led to collapse. It had to be excised. Chief Var. The voice belonged to Analyst Tierney, a young man whose face was perpetually pale from a life lived under simulated suns. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands clasped, careful not to cast his shadow over the holy schematic. "Report," Praxilla said, her eyes not leaving the slow hypnotic rotation of the city. "An anomaly, ma'am. Sector Gamma 7 of the sump. A significant one." She made a curt gesture with 2 fingers. A section of the sump, a tangled cancerous knot of habitats at the arcology's base, magnified in the hololith. A single glyph, which had been a placid blue, was now flashing a violent, insistent orange. Define significant, Tierney. A multispectrum event, duration 4.7 seconds, began with a massive concentrated energy spike, localized EM field disruption consistent with an unauthorized high-yield discharge. That was followed by an acoustic event that redlined the nearest sensor. Praxilla's focus narrowed. Her fingers danced across a console embedded in the railing before her, the hololith responding to her commands. She peeled the data apart into constituent layers. Rule out standard equipment failure, a bursting conduit or a transformer overload. Already have, ma'am, Tierney said, a flicker of pride in his voice. The energy signature is wrong. Too clean. Too focused. Not the chaotic cascade of a system's failure. And the acoustic, it's not the shriek of stressed metal. It's different. Play it, she commanded. There was a soft click. The low, omnipresent hum of the command center was shattered by a sound so alien it felt like a physical blow. It wasn't a bang or a groan. It was a furious, high-frequency hiss, a controlled, slicing sound like a blade tearing through reality. It lasted for a few seconds, then vanished, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The sterile quiet of the room felt heavier now, violated. Praxilla listened, head tilted, her expression unreadable. She played it again, and again. The hiss, the sound of directed energy, the sound of a tool. Her mind, a cold and perfect engine of logic, began to connect the variables. She overlaid the engineering schematics for GAMMA-7. Decommissioned cargo bays, no critical systems, no reason for maintenance crews to be there, and certainly not with that kind of equipment. Cross-reference the energy signature with the engineering ordnance and tool manifest, she said, her voice dropping, becoming quieter, more intent. Mum, do it. A moment later, a new window popped into view beside the sump schematic. A wireframe model of a heavy industrial tool appeared. K-class plasma torch, use restricted to external hull plate salvage and TAPS-level structural welding. Unauthorized, highly illegal in the sump. A tool of immense power, capable of cutting through a pressure door in seconds. Praxilla's gaze drifted from the tool to the location on the map. GAMMA-7, a known hub for Tidal Lord activity. Grendel Brecker's territory. Her internal calculus shifted. This was not a random event. This was not the plague spreading mindlessly through the pipes. This was organized, deliberate. She pulled up another data layer, the micro-pressure fluctuations her new sensors were sensitive enough to detect. In the minutes following the plasma event, there was a cascade of near failures in the surrounding conduits, stresses that should have led to minor breaches. But they didn't. At each point of imminent failure, there was a counterwave, a subtle, impossible equalization of pressure that stabilized the system. It looked like luck, a series of 1 in a million coincidences. Praxilla did not believe in coincidences. She looked at the pattern, the plasma cut, the series of averted disasters, the knowledge required to know exactly where those weak points were, to act with such impossible prescience. It was not human knowledge. It was the kind of intuitive, systemic understanding one might gain if one's consciousness was networked, linked directly into the bones and blood of the city itself. A cold, chilling clarity settled over her.
the dread that haunted the faces of the Spireborn, the panic she was meant to contain, was a luxury, a distraction. She had been hunting a ghost, a pathogen. She had been wrong. The choral echo wasn't just a mindless infection causing psychosis in the lower levels. It wasn't just hiding. It was being used. Jorin, the welder, patient zero. He wasn't just a sick man running for his life. His unique exposure, his deep knowledge of the city's foundations, the echo hadn't just broken his mind, it had reshaped it. It had turned him into a key, a biological master key that could feel the city's pain, and, it seemed, direct action to soothe it, or to wound it. The fugitive was not the disease. He was the vector, now wielded by another intelligence. Brecker, most likely. The Tidal Lord was using an outbreak as a weapon, a tool for his own black market ambitions. The emotional shift inside Praxilla was seismic, but silent. The detached analysis of the physician gave way to the focused, chilling intent of the hunter who has just realized her prey is not an animal, but a rival predator's trained hound. This changed the objective. Containment was a flawed strategy. You don't quarantine a weapon, you seize it. She turned from the hololith, her face a stark silhouette against the blue glow. Her eyes, cold and dark, found Tierney, who flinched under the intensity of her gaze.
"Seal the file on this anomaly," she said, her voice a low blade of sound. "Classify it under my authority alone." "Yes, Chief Var." "Divert all biometric and particulate sensor data from Gamma 7 and the surrounding sectors directly to this terminal. Filter out the noise. I don't care about the panicked masses or the background radiation of the infection." She stepped closer to him, her shadow falling over his workstation. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a near whisper, a sound more menacing than any shout. "I am no longer hunting for a plague. I am hunting for a tool. Find me the man who made that cut. Find me the hand that holds the weapon."